Next week, Arena marks the 75th birthday of the great British painter Francis Bacon. That's next Friday at 9:25. On Sunday on BBC2, The Natural World travels to the Isle of May off the Scottish coast to examine the work of artist and naturalist Keith Brockey, who spent a year there studying the wildlife.
I think drawing with a telescope is really vital in areas like this, with all the dense colonies on the cliffs. You've really got to be far enough away from the birds so you're not intruding on them. Each drawing is a distillation of many hours sitting watching the bird and sketching. I really do enjoy the seals out here, sketching and painting them. The seal pups are great wide-eyed things, all lying, fattening up on their cow's milk. Usually the pups lie on their backs, rolling about asleep most of the time, making strange gurgling noises. They're really super things to draw.
One Man's Island, The Natural World, on Sunday at 7:45 on BBC2. Now on to Newsnight.
Good evening. A government minister tonight compares miners' pickets with the IRA. And the Coal Board claims that the drift back to work will continue and even gain momentum. As the Whitwell pit in North Derbyshire becomes the fourth colliery there to produce coal, miners' pickets in Yorkshire clash with police over the one man who's gone back to work at the pit where it all began, at Corton Wood. Michael Eaton, the Coal Board's public relations spokesman, and an official of the Derbyshire NUM, debate the issue. Is the strike now really crumbling or not? And also, tonight, the horror of death in a blazing aeroplane. Scientists believe they may now have found a fuel that won't explode. We report on the planned plane crash that should lead to greater safety for all of us.
In New York, the United Nations Security Council goes into emergency session in 2 hours' time to discuss Nicaragua. There, 22,000 volunteers are taken off the coffee harvest and mobilized to defend the country. But Washington says, we won't invade. Back home, a Christmas present from the building societies. Mortgage rates will come down next month. It should be by 1%. And Soviet paratroops invade America. Don't worry, it's only fiction. We look at the film that has taken America by storm.
The National Union of Mine Workers has scored one important point today. It was revealed in the High Court that the sequestrators, looking for up to £8 million worth of NUM funds, had only managed to lay their hands on £8,178 so far. Over £2 million is in Dublin, where the sequestrators are taking legal action to attempt to secure it, and the rest is in the United States. Meanwhile, Mr. Adam Butler, Minister of State for Defence Procurement, said tonight, the IRA is not the only threat from within now. Others are only too ready to lay siege to our democratic traditions. We now find private armies of pickets whose sole reason for being there is the intimidation of those who do not share their point of view. And the miners' president, Mr. Scargill, is tonight speaking at a rally of Shirebrook miners in North Derbyshire, after a week in which more than 1,000 North Derbyshire miners are said by the Coal Board to have spearheaded an overall return to work by some 2,200 miners over the country as a whole. The Coal Board claimed their breakthrough point this week has been in the North Derbyshire coalfield, where they say 1,061 miners have gone back to work since Monday. That, they say, brings the total working in North Derbyshire to 2,282 out of a workforce of 10,000. And coal is being produced at 4 of the area's 9 pits. The western area is the next most promising for the NCB. They claim 527 new strikebreakers this week. Yesterday's vote to continue the strike at Bersham Colliery was a setback for the NCB, but today another 17 returned to work at that pit. And the board says there are now 9,471 working in western area out of 16,500. In Scotland, the Coal Board claims another 104 working miners this week, mainly at the Bilston Glen colliery, to make a total now working in Scotland of 470 out of a total force of 12,300. In the Yorkshire area, this week's figure of 177 new working miners takes the NCB's total so far to 277, a drop in the ocean compared to the 53,000 still on strike in Yorkshire. One of the miners who returned yesterday was at the Corton Wood pit, whose threatened closure helped provoke the strike in the first place. There were violent scenes there today for the second day running. Police described the scene as a battleground after police vans were attacked by a barrage of missiles and one was overturned and set on fire. The community at Corton Wood has now paid a heavy price for just one man going back to work. Last night, Peter Heathfield, the Miners' Union General Secretary, said miners who'd broken the strike would be regarded as lepers. But as the week ends, the pressure is on Mr. Heathfield and the NUM. From Neil Kinnock, the Labour leader who's refused invitations to appear at the union's rallies, from the TUC president, Jack Eccles, who said today that the objectives of the striking miners cannot be reached, and from Ian McGregor, the Coal Board chairman, who's made it clear there's no point in further talks, and who has reminded miners that if they don't return to work on November the 19th, in 10 days' time, they'll lose the £525 extra payment that would be due to them in Christmas week for holiday and rest day bonuses. Mr. Burrows, a bad week for you.
Not a bad week at all. The pressure's been on us from day one of the strike, and of course with the media coverage and the Coal Board's activities over the past few days, it's inevitable that in desperate times some of our people will return to work.
But let's talk about the return to work rather than the media coverage. 2,200, is that the figure you accept?
Well, I've seen in the short minutes that I've had before I came into the studio 3 different newspapers, and each of the 3 different newspapers produce different figures. Which are the ones that are correct? I mean, we've been talking to the board over the past few weeks about let's have a look at the real figures, and up to now not one of the board's side have been prepared to show us the books so that we can have a look at the figures.
Well, they are saying that 2,200 have returned to work this week. Are you saying you don't accept that?
Of course I don't accept that. They're talking in one paper of 1,900, in another paper of 2,173, and in another paper 2,000. Which of the figures are correct?
Well, let's ask Mr. Eaton. Michael Eaton, which is the correct figure?
Well, the precise number, I think, is quite irrelevant. The point of the matter is that some 2,000 people, or more than 2,000 people, and I think the correct figure actually is 2,200.
That is the number the NCB gave us today, yes.
Right, have returned to work during this week. And I think that that is because the miners feel the despair of the end of the negotiations. They feel despair that they can't make their views known, and they're presenting their opinion by appearing at work. I think that it's as simple as that.
Mr. Burrows?
Have not the miners at Bersham made their views felt? Have they not had the opportunity there and come over in a positive way from a pit that originally was opposed to the strike? A ballot, a secret ballot of the membership has produced a result that I'm certain the Coal Board will not want to talk about.
Well, now, before we ask Mr. Eaton to comment on that, is that not an argument that perhaps you might deploy for a national ballot of miners?
Well, of course, that's been dealt with on a local issue, and local issues at that particular pit have been well argued by the people that are involved there. I'm certain that, once again, if it became a national issue, the media would intervene and directly debar our people from putting over our point of view.
Mr. Eaton?
Well, at Bersham Colliery, there was a difference of 9 votes between those who wanted to remain on strike and those who wanted to continue at work. 154 as opposed to 145. But there were 62 people who did not vote, who were there actually working down the pit at the time. Now, presumably, they would have voted to go to work. So if you add the 62 to the 145, that would have been a substantial majority for returning to work. Indeed, I don't think it can give any comfort to the NUM, because only 37% of those miners voted to remain on strike. And indeed, as has just been reported, a further 17 returned to work today. I think that the very opposite of what is being said is proved by the Bersham vote, that there is a desire now to return to work by the mining industry generally. And I do point out that at Bersham, a week ago, there were no miners working. Today, there are 77.
Mr. Burrows, to reinforce the point that Mr. Eaton's just made, what do you say to the TUC President, Mr. Eccles, who said today, let me just quote him to you again, how much longer the suffering must continue before it is realized by striking miners that the objectives of their principal officers cannot be reached? I simply don't know. What would you say to Mr. Eccles, as well as Mr. Eaton?
Well, the suffering will continue. Of course there's suffering. It's inevitable after 8 months of dispute with no wages coming in. The suffering's there. Our people have been prepared to put up with that for the last 8 months. Can I just make this point about Bersham?
But the point Mr. Eccles is making, with respect, the point Mr. Eccles is making is that he's saying that the objectives of the principal officers of the union simply won't be reached. You're expecting too much.
But they are being accepted by 150,000 of our members and have continued to be accepted. The Bersham thing, I need to come back to it, I'm sorry. 81 of our members who are on strike also didn't vote in that particular ballot. And once again we've got a situation when a ballot has been taken, everybody crying for a ballot, then the coal board, because it's not gone their way, are saying that there are direct alternatives that could have been taken. Now, where can we get when we're saying one day have a ballot and it goes the wrong way and the people are crying about it? It's absolutely impossible to do anything at all at present time that suits the coal board.
I read, by the way, Mr. Burrows, that Mr. Scargill at that rally that we were talking about just now has just said that Mr. Scargill and Mr. Heathfield have just said that they might be jailed by Christmas. There's every prospect that the rallies and mass meetings that we should be addressing between now and Christmas will not take place because we will be called before his lordship. Now, what do you think would be the effect of Mr. Scargill and Mr. Heathfield going to jail?
Well, I don't think that the courts or even the working miners and the people that are financing them are looking for martyrs. I'm certain that Arthur, like myself and other members of the officials of the trade union, are prepared, if necessary, to go to jail. Our lads are now being sent to jail for simple obstruction charges. If the lads can put up with that sort of problems, then certainly the officials of the union can.
Do you think all this appealing to the courts helps, frankly, Mr. Eaton? I mean, what do you think would be the effect of Mr. Scargill going to jail?
Well, Mr. Scargill going to jail is not a matter of importance to me. The fact of the matter is that the mining industry is on strike, and it's the mining industry that we are concerned about. I think the appalling things that were said yesterday by both Mr. Scargill and Mr. Heathfield about men who return to work being lepers is really an irresponsible thing to say. It makes me really wonder whether they are concerned about the welfare of the NUM or they are concerned about destroying the NUM. I think that it should be remembered by the union leaders who really are talking about being through the pain barrier and 8 months of deprivation. I don't think that they sound very human at all to me, and I think their concern should be really attempting to get their men back to work. The negotiations are over. The coal board have moved some substantial way. Mr. Scargill has said, and I quote him, I'm not quoting something I'm saying myself, I'm quoting him, that he has not moved since March the 6th. We've made substantial changes to our situation, and if we can negotiate, or had been able to negotiate with a union who were prepared to negotiate with us, then we would have found a solution to the dispute. But now, the real despair that our men see when they know that we've made a fair offer, and I'm sure they do, this is now the problem which is facing the union, because I think that people will keep reappearing at work.
But Mr. Eaton, what is your message to Mr. Burrows here and Mr. Scargill? Is it, as Mr. McGregor appeared to be saying a few days ago, that there's really no point in talking anymore?
Well, there isn't any point in us talking anymore. We've offered all that we can. We've made very, very fair offers. It's well known to everyone, and I won't repeat it now. But in the point of a pit coming up to closure, we've accepted the fact that a third party can have an opinion. Both sides can put an opinion to the third party, and we will take due weight of what they say. Really, what can be fairer than that? I can't think of anything that can be fairer. We have to take the responsibility in the coal board for the closure of collieries or the continuation of them. That's our responsibility under the law, under the Nationalisation Act. But we have made this major concession that we will let a third party look at the situation. And I just can't think of anything fairer, and I don't think our men can.
Mr. Burrows.
Well, Mr. Eaton makes us longer speeches out of Scargill occasionally. Third-party intervention, yes. Will the coal board, I asked the question to Mr. Eaton, will the coal board accept that if the third-party intervention says that no, the coal board should not close down a colliery, that colliery remains open?
Mr. Eaton, a quick response to that?
Well, we have said we will give due weight to it, and that has been agreed by one of our unions, and of course we would. We must do. That's why we've made the point.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Burrows.
The board have been giving due weight to the question on closures for the past 10, 15 years, and at the end of every due weight consideration, they have closed down the collieries. It's time to stop closing collieries and keep people in work in this country.
And very finally, Mr. Burrows, a comment on Mr. Adam Butler's remark this evening that he's comparing pickets to the IRA.
Well, it's not a new thing, is it, that pickets and the IRA are being compared. As far as I'm concerned, that it's a superfluous argument.
Mr. Burrows, thank you. Mr. Eaton, thank you. Paul.
Thank you.
Just over 7 years ago, in the worst ever crash in aviation history, 2 Boeing 747 jumbo jets collided in fog at Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife. The crash should have been survived by most of those on board because the impact was relatively minor. But in the event, almost 600 people died, most of them burnt to death in a fireball that engulfed the 2 planes. That terrible accident led to the British and American authorities to embark on a program not to prevent air crashes, but to make them less lethal. Next week, the most spectacular test so far of their progress will be staged. If it's a success, it could mean a major advance in air safety. Next week, if all goes right, a 23-year-old Boeing 720 will take off from Edwards Air Force Base in California on its 52,483rd flight. It'll be on a mission to improve air safety. On board will be 65 passengers and crew travelling at the American government's expense. But it won't be exactly a normal flight. The pilot, in his cockpit, will be flying the plane from the ground via radio control. The Boeing will be airborne for some 12 minutes and will then come back to a prepared landing site for what the Americans term a full-scale transport controlled impact demonstration. In other words, a deliberate air crash.
It's the first time ever that we've had what you might term a controlled crash, a remotely piloted airliner, a 4-engined airliner, being deliberately brought in and crash-landed to enable people to find out what actually happens inside the cabin in a situation like that. We don't know. In the past, in such accidents, virtually everybody has been killed.
The sort of crash the Americans are staging is one that could occur either on landing or shortly after an aborted takeoff. So the Boeing will approach the crash site at a modest speed of only 150 knots and at a fairly gentle angle of attack. The crash is specifically designed not to rip the plane's fuselage apart. What the Americans want is a crash that should be survivable for most of the occupants. It may be possible in theory to survive a crash at that speed, but the sad fact is that in practice, too many people still don't get out alive. If you can imagine the chaos of a plane like this smacking the ground at 150 miles an hour or more, maybe you can understand why. You'd have all these luggage lockers bursting open like that. The air would be full of bags and bottles flying around your head, maybe even hitting you. These galley doors would break open like this. The trays would come whistling out through the air. The galley trolleys would come roaring along here and again maybe flying up in the air. All the wreckage that would leave would block these aisles and you would essentially be trapped in the plane. And being trapped in a plane after a crash is no joke, especially if these seats catch fire, because they're full of plastic foam, and if they do catch fire, they'd fill the whole plane with poisonous fumes. The American crash plane will be a flying laboratory, collecting data that can help the designers minimize deaths and injuries in these so-called survivable crashes. The cabin will be packed with 65 life-size dummies, some wired up to measure the forces generated on the body by the crash impact. Similar instruments will measure breakaway forces in the overhead lockers and the galley compartments. There'll be 18 different seat designs on trial to see which stands up best, and new harnesses will be on test too. Children have not been forgotten, and nor have the crew. and the moment of impact will be recorded by 10 onboard cameras, which will give the Americans their first definitive picture of the carnage that a crash can cause, and how it happens.
The data can be disseminated and analysed right round the world so that designers and manufacturers of engines, airframes, systems, furniture, panels, windows, loos, galleys, the lot will have a better idea of safety requirements. You can begin to see where things need to be toughened up, improved, altered in shape, so that in future the design of the aeroplane, both inside and outside, can be made that much better with a view to overall safety.
But what occurs inside the plane is only half the story, because by far the biggest single killer in so-called survivable crashes is fire. In March 1977, two Boeing 747 jumbo jets collided on the runway at Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife. The two planes burst into flames and almost 600 people died. Without the fireball that engulfed them, most of those people would still be alive today, because the impact itself was fairly minor. The fuel that those two aircraft were carrying was kerosene. Unlike petrol, it's not particularly volatile. In a dish, it's almost impossible to light it. But if in a crash a fuel tank is ruptured and kerosene escapes, the surrounding airstream will turn the fuel into a light mist, and any spark will then ignite it. The aircraft can then be engulfed in a firestorm that can destroy planes and passengers alike. Now that misting is what happened in the Tenerife crash and in numerous others where people have been burnt to death. But next week's Boeing will be carrying a revolutionary new fuel, a kerosene that does not mist, and one therefore that should not burst into flames when the aircraft crashes. The test this new fuel will have to pass could hardly be tougher. As the Boeing hits the ground, pylons will tear off the plane's wings and rupture its fuel tanks. And just to make sure there are some sparks around, there'll be naked flame torches for the crashing plane to run through. Yet despite all, the scientists are sure that their invention will work.
I've got a great deal of confidence that we're not going to see a fire. I've seen enough. After all, this experiment or this particular event is little more than a large-scale experiment, and we've got a lot of experience to say that the small-scale experiments to say that this is a very powerful fire suppressant. So I don't think we're going to see a fire.
The new fuel is a British invention, developed in tandem by ICI and the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. It contains an additive called FM9, which is a polymer like those found in paints. It has taken 20 years and more of research to bring it to its present state. The first anti-misting fuels were not spectacularly effective at suppressing fire. What's more, they were hard to pump and even harder to burn than an aircraft engine. But the latest version of AMK, for which British chemical company ICI has a world monopoly, has solved enough of the initial problems to make it a runner.
Assuming that the Boeing doesn't actually burst into flames, and the experts are fairly sure that it won't, then we're essentially at the end of the beginning. The research program is over, and we've proved that AMK is a fuel that could save lives. But to get from there to the point where it's loaded onto your flight to New York or Spain or Greece or wherever you're going, is going to take a huge amount of time, a vast amount of money, an enormous amount of development work, and not least, a great deal of political wrangle.
The biggest problem with using anti-misting kerosene is you need to modify aircraft engines. Since AMK won't burn when it's released into the air, it also won't burn properly when you push it into a jet engine. Instead of coming into the combustion chamber as a fine mist which can be ignited, AMK comes out more like spaghetti. And the engines either won't work properly or won't work at all unless you have what's called a degrader to break the fuel down before it's ignited. This degrader effectively chops up the additives and makes the fuel behave once more like ordinary kerosene. The Americans have developed a degrader which works well enough to fly the Boeing 720 they're testing. But it wouldn't be safe enough, cheap enough, or light enough to do the job on active service.
The aircraft that we are going to see crashing uses degraders that are quite unsuitable for long-term regular use. So we need the development of a degrader that will satisfactorily degrade the fuel, that will not consume vast amounts of energy to do so, which is what happens in the existing system, and that has the reliability of current equipment, because it's a prime component. If anything goes wrong with that, then we could be in difficulty.
Developing and testing a foolproof degrader is just a first problem. The next is, if AMK is introduced, it's likely to come in piecemeal. Some jets will use it, other jets won't. And the result could be there will be two sorts of fuel at many airports, and thus the chance that a plane could load up with the wrong sort of kerosene. If a plane not equipped to use AMK tries to burn it, the scientists say the engines will at some stage stop working. They might do so on the runway, but they might do so in mid-flight. And in that case, the new lifesaver would turn into a killer. It's a possibility the authorities are well aware of, and it will guide their actions.
Preventing that crash is what I call primary safety. Making the crash more survivable is secondary. And anti-misting kerosene is therefore a secondary safety advantage. But there is a risk and a possibility that anti-misting kerosene or the modifications to aircraft to enable them to use that fuel could erode primary safety and in principle could even cause a crash.
If the various problems are solved, then anti-misting kerosene could be saving lives by the early 1990s. The airlines won't go for it voluntarily because, to be brutal, there's nothing in it for them. But if the authorities, like the CAA and America's equivalent, the FAA, decide that anti-misting kerosene can be made safe and will save lives, then they have the power to force the airlines to adopt it. And the betting is they'll use that power.
I personally think they will. Anything that can conceivably be seen to be improving aviation safety must, at the end of the day, be acceptable. It must be acceptable to the authorities, it must be acceptable to the airlines, and to the travelling public.
It's the travelling public who will have to pay for the development of AMK and its use if it is adopted. Quite how much it will cost, no one yet knows. It will be pounds rather than pence on the cost of a ticket. But, say the advocates, even that is a small price to pay if AMK does in fact save lives. Now today's main news stories. The United Nations Security Council will go into emergency session in just over an hour's time to consider Nicaragua. The Nicaraguans asked for the meeting after what they called increased American aggression against their country. In Washington, the US State Department has denied that America plans to invade, but President Reagan has said that the CIA funding of right-wing Contra guerrillas must continue. Meanwhile, in Nicaragua, there's a growing fear that invasion is on the way. The country appears to have been buzzed for the second time by an American spy plane, and 20,000 students who volunteered for the coffee harvest have been told they will be armed instead to defend the country. At the port of Corinto, the Russian freighter allegedly carrying military equipment continues to unload at some distance from prying cameras. The Russians and the Nicaraguans have both now told the Americans that there are no MiGs on board. And in Moscow, television has accused the Americans of inventing the MiG story to create an excuse for invading Nicaragua. Britain's two largest building societies are cutting their interest rates, and the others are expected to follow suit. It'll probably mean about 1% off mortgages from next month. That will reduce monthly repayments by £5 for each £10,000 borrowed. The Halifax and Abbey National will bring their rates down to 11 7/8%. The other large societies and the banks will announce their new rates next week. The 9-day strike at Jaguar is over. All three plants have accepted an improved pay offer, though it is still a 2-year deal rather than the 1-year agreement the unions wanted. At Austin Rover, 2,700 men at Swindon have voted to end their strike. It brings the total working to 6,000, just over a fifth of the workforce. A British Transport Police report on the Wembley train crash last month, which killed 3 people, is to go to the Director of Public Prosecutions. At a public inquiry into the crash today, the driver of one of the 2 trains involved declined to give evidence. In India, some of Mrs. Gandhi's ashes have been brought back by her son Rajiv to Allahabad, the city where she was born. A huge crowd of mourners, estimated at well over 100,000 strong, turned out to watch the ceremonies. The crowd was almost entirely Hindu and in excitable mood. No Sikh mourners had dared to attend. Tonight, though, it's reported that some 8,000 Sikhs have left refugee camps in New Delhi and returned home, and the curfew there has been relaxed. In Sri Lanka, troops have killed several Tamils and injured others in Jaffna. Reports say 7 people died and 50 others were hurt by indiscriminate firing. The government say the troops killed 3 guerrillas who had attacked a convoy and that 23 bystanders were injured. There have been riots in Zimbabwe following the killing of a senior member of Robert Mugabe's government party. Dissidents shot the man at his home near Beit Bridge, close to the South African border. The government say a number of other people have now been killed in the town by supporters of Mr. Mugabe. West Germany's relations with Eastern Europe came under renewed strain today. The Bonn government decided to expel 5 Romanian diplomats. Intelligence sources say the 5 were involved in a terror campaign against Romanian émigrés and in a plot to blow up Radio Free Europe. Meanwhile, 2 months after 150 East Germans sought asylum in the West German embassy in Prague, more East Germans have sought refuge in the embassies in Warsaw and in Romania's capital, Bucharest. In Libya, charges are to be brought against 2 of the Britons who've been detained since May. The charges relate to state secrets. 6 men were held in the aftermath of the Libyan embassy siege in London. 2 have since been released. News of the charges was given 2 days ago to the British consul in the Libyan capital, Tripoli. 1,000 police officers from all over the country attended the funeral in Leeds of Police Sergeant John Speed. He was shot 9 days ago when he went to the aid of a colleague. The service was held only yards from where he was killed. Excuse me. Extradition proceedings will begin tomorrow in Dublin against an Australian wanted for questioning in Australia about 3 murders and organised crime. Robert Trimboli appeared in court today and was remanded for 24 hours. He was arrested 2 weeks ago. Excuse me. Keith Cottingham, the man wanted in connection with a parcel bomb explosion which killed a Kent woman, Barbara Harold, earlier this year, is being held in a Spanish jail. It's suggested that Mrs. Harold sold him his Spanish villa, and he's been under surveillance by Spanish police for some time. He's been charged with illegal possession of firearms, but this he denies, and any connection with the British bombing.
Absolutely ridiculous. I go to England for a holiday, I return, and about 10 days later, I hear from my brother-in-law there's been an explosion. And the person who it went to was a woman, and apparently she died afterwards.
Did you know the person who died or any of the family?
I've never met them, seen them, or spoken to them.
Vanessa Redgrave has been awarded $100,000 by an American court. She had sued the Boston Symphony Orchestra for $5 million when they cancelled a performance after receiving threats by militant Zionists. But the jury rejected her claim that she was fired because of her pro-Palestine politics. The strange saga of Mr. Tiny Rowland and Harrods continues. Last week, Rowland's group Lonro apparently ended its 6-year battle for Harrods when it sold its near 30% share in House of Fraser, which owns the store. Now Lonro has spent £20 million on buying House of Fraser shares again. Share prices got a boost on the stock exchange today with news of that cut in mortgage rates. The FT 30-share index closed at 900.1, up 7.1. But the pound's value dropped against most currencies today, with the sterling index closing at 76.3, down 0.2. And in New York, the pound closed at $1.2615, down 0.7% from this morning's opening level in London. And the Dow Jones index closed at 1,218.97, down 9.72.
Now, here's an evocative memory for cinema buffs. Does this ring a bell?
Speak English, comrades. Remember, that is about the only freedom you do not have in this town. This American town.
Americans, they have too many freedoms. acquainted with the
This was Red Nightmare, an American film in the early 60s that revived echoes of McCarthyism and the spectre of Soviet subversion inside America, and even of a Soviet occupation. It was one of a long line of movies like The Iron Curtain, 1948, and a year later, The Woman on Pier 13, otherwise known as I Married a Communist. Even the later Invasion of the Body Snatchers was seen by some as a sort of allegory of a Soviet takeover. Well, it appears that the cycle of Russophobia is not over yet. On top of all the patriotic talk that helped President Reagan to victory and that now helps to colour the fuss about Nicaragua, a new American film has just been released in London that's already breaking box office records in America. It shows a small American community in Colorado suddenly aware that it's being invaded from the skies.
Be allowed to go free. Well now, my friend. Well now.
Oh, check it out.
All right.
It looks pretty cool though, man.
I would say they were way off course. This is very unusual.
You do something, Mr. Teasdale.
Don't yell it! Don't yell it, my friend! Combustible!
The critics have on the whole been pretty scathing. The movie goes down and down, alternating its guerrilla-like action with gorilla-like philosophizing, The Guardian. It's a film that is often silly and facile, says the Mail. And according to the Times, it should reliably generate real terror among the millions of naive and impressionable American teenagers likely to see it. In America, it caused a political storm. They are promoting international hatred, said the leader of the National TV and Movie Coalition. But some, like Alexander Haig, the former Secretary of State, have praised the film as an important, realistic and provocative lesson on the need to preserve our military strength. But then, General Haig is a director of MGM United Artists that produced the film. John Milius, who's the director, seems, however, to have struck a chord with many young Americans, mostly males. This may not be so surprising, since the heroes are all American, high school teenagers who wage a guerrilla war from the Colorado mountains and find they have to live dangerously when they hit town.
Louis, how you doing? Was he scared of us?
You don't understand. They know who all of you are. They're looking for you.
Who?
The KGB.
Oh, the Russians?
And Cubans.
Cubans. Look, have you seen my father? I called, there was no answer. I went by the station, it was empty.
I'm going to tell you something I'm not supposed to talk about. Nobody is. But
what?
But they took a lot of people away. People that they thought were going to make trouble for them. People that had guns or things they wanted. They just took them away.
Where?
Re-education camps, that's what they call it. The drive-in. I heard they took a lot of people to... Jed, I pray for you.
Well, now, we asked Patrick Sloyan, who is the London correspondent of the Newsday newspaper in America, to watch the film for us. He went to the cinema tonight, and he's done it especially for us, and he's come here to tell us what he made of it. Now, Pat, is this film really as bad as it looks?
You won't see hardcore propaganda here, I'm afraid. I think this is really a program designed for high school students, not very bright high school students, because they are the ones that lead the guerrilla war against the Soviet invaders. But it's got bits of everything. It has the National Rifle Association view on everybody keeping guns. It has the famous bumper sticker. They can take my gun when they pry it from my dead cold fingers. A Cuban army officer hooked up with the Russians actually does that in one scene. It has something for the good old boys who like to sit around and drink moonshine out of ball jars, they're called in the United States. That happens. But essentially it's for the the high school student crowd.
How unlikely is the scenario, the Russians arriving in the middle of Colorado? I mean, is it patently absurd?
Well, certainly it is, but it gives a chance for Hollywood to deal with all these thrilling guerrilla war films that we saw during World War II. I mean, when you could justifiably deal with the Nazis and the Japanese, now Hollywood doesn't have anybody to deal with these days, so I think they just try to take it a little further forward. As one of the heavies in this movie says, it had to come sooner or later, the two toughest kids on the block.
All right, but now does it matter? I mean, for example, we have the president of your National TV and Movie Coalition saying the film promotes international hatred. He takes it seriously. Well, so did Alexander Haig, but I think the average British viewer is going to go in there and get a laugh. I see one heavy is asked at one point, who's helping us now that we're smack dab in the middle of World War III? And he said, the people in Europe are sitting this one out, except Britain, and he didn't think they were going to last much longer. Patrick, what do you put down the box office success in America to? I mean, do you think that tells us something about the American young people, the audience who are watching it?
Well, H.L. Mencken, the sage of Baltimore, said no one ever went broke in the United States underestimating the taste of the American people. And I think this film is proof of that.
We understand it's been excluded from the London Film Festival. Now, do you think someone's taking life a bit seriously this end as well?
Well, I found that a high-quality, well-produced, well-photographed, is up in the Rocky Mountains.
Good fun. Good watch.
Entertainment.
It wasn't a wasted evening?
No, not really.
Patrick, Florian, thank you very much indeed. Well, now, a quick look at tomorrow's weather. It'll start cloudy in many areas with rain at times. Brighter weather will move northwards and eastwards to all parts except the extreme north of Scotland by the end of the afternoon. It'll be mild just about everywhere. And a look at the headlines in the morning papers. The Times has Nicaragua appeals to the UN as fear of invasion mounts. The Guardian has court nets only £8,000 of miners' £8.9 million cash. Miners' slippery millions, says the Daily Mail. Royals on IRA death list. The Sun has. A member of the royal family will be the next target of IRA murderers, security chiefs feared last night. Financial Times prefers the news about the mortgage rate cut. Daily Express has Special Air Service guard on royals. Armed SAS troops are guarding the royal family round the clock after an IRA death threat against them. Goodness me. Daily Telegraph has NUM funds puzzle for judge. Hunt for millions yields £8,000. And over on the right here, cheaper home loans and truce in the savings war. And Morning Star, Nicaragua gets set to repel United States attack. And finally, the Daily Mirror, front page, has a message to Daily Mirror readers from the Prime Minister. And it then actually photocopies a letter from Margaret Thatcher to Mr. Maxwell, and I think I really won't read that out to you. With that, we say goodbye until Monday at 10:55. Join us then. A very good night to you.